It was a typical Monday morning at the bustling elementary school. Kids were chattering in the hallways, backpacks swung over their shoulders, and the faint smell of markers and fresh bulletin boards filled the air. In Mrs. Parker's classroom, the students were settling into their seats for what should have been a routine start to the week. But little did anyone know, something shocking was about to unfold, something that would leave the entire school talking. Mrs. Parker, known for her strict demeanor and no-nonsense approach to teaching, was running through her usual checklist. She glanced at her students, making sure everyone was present and prepared. One boy in particular, a cheerful and slightly mischievous kid with a mop of unruly hair, had been fiddling with something on his desk. Mrs. Parker had already warned him twice to focus, but when he didn't listen, she decided it was time to take action. Annoyed, she marched over to his desk and noticed a small tube of glue in his hand. Without thinking twice, she grabbed it from him. "You need to pay attention," she said firmly. In her frustration, she noticed a strand of his hair falling into his face and made an impulsive decision. "Let me fix that for you," she added with a sharp tone, opening the glue cap and pressing a small amount into his hair to hold it in place. The classroom went silent. The students stared in shock, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. The boy sat frozen, his smile fading as he realized what had just happened. But Mrs. Parker didn't seem to notice the gravity of her mistake, or the wide-eyed glances being exchanged around the room. What Mrs. Parker didn't know was that this wasn't just any student. This boy's father wasn't a typical parent. He was the school's principal. And as word of the incident spread like wildfire through the hallways, it was only a matter of time before it reached his office. As the bell rang for recess, the classroom buzzed with a nervous energy. Whispers and giggles filled the air as students tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The boy, still stunned, didn't move from his seat. He touched his hair gently, feeling the sticky patch where the glue had dried. His usually cheerful face was a mix of embarrassment and confusion. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he tell his dad? Would Mrs. Parker get in trouble? Meanwhile, Mrs. Parker, unaware of the brewing storm, dismissed the students for recess. She stayed behind to tidy up her desk, her mind already shifting to the next lesson. It wasn't until a small group of students hesitated at the door, casting her nervous glances, that she started to feel something was off. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, trying to read their expressions. They nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact, and scurried out the door. Mrs. Parker shrugged, assuming it was just typical playground gossip. She didn't realize those same students were heading straight for the principal's office, eager to share what had happened. Down the hallway, the boy had decided he couldn't stay quiet. It wasn't just about the glue. It was about the way it made him feel. He loved his dad, admired him even, and he knew that being the principal's son came with a certain level of expectation. But today, he felt humiliated. It wasn't just his hair. It was the way Mrs. Parker had handled it, as if his feelings didn't matter. He didn't want to make a scene, but he also didn't want to let it slide. The principal's office was calm, the usual hum of administrative work filling the air. Mr. Bennett, a kind but firm leader, sat at his desk, reviewing a stack of paperwork. When his son walked in, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The boy hesitated for a moment, clutching his backpack straps tightly, before finally blurting out, "Dad, Mrs. Parker put glue in my hair." Mr. Bennett's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean, glue in your hair?" he asked, his tone a mix of concern and disbelief. The boy explained everything, his words tumbling out in a rush. As he spoke, Mr. Bennett leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. He didn't interrupt, letting his son get it all out. By the time the boy finished, tears were welling up in his eyes. "It wasn't fair," he said softly, looking down at the floor. Mr. Bennett stood up and walked over to his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said gently. "But don't worry. I'll take care of it." At that moment, the door to the office opened, and Mrs. Parker stepped in, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. "Mr. Bennett, I need to discuss the upcoming field trip plans," she started, but then she noticed the boy sitting there, his face still flushed. Her smile faltered. Mr. Bennett's gaze shifted to her, calm but firm. "Mrs. Parker, I think we need to have a different conversation first." The room grew silent. Mrs. Parker glanced between Mr. Bennett and his son, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. "Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously. Mr. Bennett gestured for his son to wait outside the office. The boy hesitated but eventually nodded and left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Once it closed, Mr. Bennett turned back to Mrs. Parker, his expression unreadable. "Can you explain what happened in class today?" he asked, his tone measured but serious. Mrs. Parker blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, trying to buy herself some time. "About the glue," Mr. Bennett clarified, folding his arms. "My son just told me you put glue in his hair. Is that true?" Her heart sank. Suddenly, the events of the morning rushed back to her. She realized how her quick, frustrated decision had spiraled into something much bigger. "I didn't mean for it to be a big deal," she began, her voice defensive. "He was distracted, and I was trying to make a point. I didn't think." "That's the problem," Mr. Bennett interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't think. You're a professional, Mrs. Parker. You're supposed to guide and support these students, not embarrass them." Mrs. Parker opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. She could feel the weight of his words settling over her. She knew he was right. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, looking down at her hands. "It was a mistake. I wasn't trying to hurt him." Mr. Bennett nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand that. But you need to understand how it made him feel. This isn't just about glue. It's about trust. Students need to feel safe and respected in your classroom." Mrs. Parker nodded, her face flushed with shame. "I'll apologize to him," she said quickly, "and to the class. I'll make it right." "That's a start," Mr. Bennett said. "But we're also going to have a conversation about how to handle situations like this in the future. You're an experienced teacher, Mrs. Parker. I know you can do better." As the conversation continued behind closed doors, the boy sat outside the office, nervously swinging his legs. He didn't know what was being said, but he hoped his dad was standing up for him. For the first time all day, he felt a small flicker of hope that things might actually get better. What no one realized yet was that this incident would set off a chain reaction, one that would challenge everyone involved to rethink the way they approached teaching, discipline, and understanding. As the day went on, the atmosphere of the school grew increasingly tense. Word of what happened in Mrs. Parker's class had spread, not just among the students but also to some of the other teachers. By lunchtime, it seemed like everyone had an opinion. Some dismissed it as a minor incident blown out of proportion, while others felt Mrs. Parker had crossed a serious line. The boy, meanwhile, kept his head down. He sat with his usual group of friends in the cafeteria, but his mind wasn't on their conversations or the food on his tray. He kept replaying the moment over and over in his head. The laughter of his classmates, the feeling of the glue drying stiff in his hair, the way it made him feel small and powerless. His dad had promised to handle it, but he couldn't shake the fear that somehow things might get worse. Back in the principal's office, Mr. Bennett was already taking steps to address the situation. After his conversation with Mrs. Parker, he had asked her to draft an apology, not just for his son, but for the entire class. He wanted her to understand the importance of accountability and to demonstrate to the students that even adults could admit when they were wrong. But privately, Mr. Bennett wrestled with his own concerns. He knew the pressures teachers like Mrs. Parker faced every day, and he didn't want to create a culture of fear among his staff. At the same time, he couldn't ignore what had happened or the impact it had on his son. By the time the students returned to Mrs. Parker's classroom after lunch, The tension was palpable. The boy slid into his seat, avoiding eye contact with his teacher. Mrs. Parker stood at the front of the room, her usual confidence replaced by an uneasy stiffness. She cleared her throat and began speaking, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Before we get started," she said, glancing at the boy, "I want to talk about something that happened this morning. I made a mistake, and I need to apologize." The class went silent. Even the students who had been whispering moments earlier now sat up, their attention fully on Mrs. Parker. "I was frustrated, and I acted without thinking," she continued, her eyes scanning the room. "I did something I shouldn't have, and it wasn't fair to the person involved. I want you all to know that I'm sorry. My job is to make this classroom a safe and respectful place, and today, I didn't live up to that." She paused, taking a deep breath before looking directly at the boy. "To you," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "I'm especially sorry. What I did was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." The boy felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward him. He nodded quickly, not trusting himself to speak. Part of him felt a small sense of relief at her words, but another part wasn't sure if an apology could erase how he had felt in that moment. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered. After school, the boy walked out to meet his dad, who was waiting by the car. Mr. Bennett crouched down to meet him at eye level. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. The boy shrugged. "She said she was sorry," he mumbled. "And how did that make you feel?" his dad pressed. "I don't know," the boy admitted. "Better, I guess, but everyone kept staring at me. It was weird." Mr. Bennett nodded, understanding the weight of what his son was saying. "Sometimes, even when people apologize, it doesn't take away all the hurt," he said. "But it's a step. And I'm proud of you for handling it so well today." The boy gave a small smile, feeling a little lighter knowing his dad was in his corner. But the day wasn't over yet. That evening, as Mr. Bennett sat at home, he received an email from a parent, then another, and another. It seemed some of the students had gone home and shared the story with their families, and now parents were weighing in. Some were outraged, demanding that Mrs. Parker face consequences, while others expressed sympathy, arguing that everyone makes mistakes. One email, however, caught his attention. It was from a parent whose child had been in Mrs. Parker's class years ago. They shared a story of how she had once gone above and beyond to help their shy daughter come out of her shell, describing Mrs. Parker as one of the most caring teachers they had ever encountered. It was a reminder of how complex people could be, capable of both great kindness and lapses in judgment. The next day at school, things seemed to settle down, but underneath the surface, tensions were still bubbling. Mrs. Parker's colleagues were divided. Some felt she had been unfairly targeted for what they considered a momentary lapse, while others believed she should have known better. Students whispered about what might happen to her, and even the boy, despite his dad's reassurances, couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of something much bigger than he'd intended. Mr. Bennett, meanwhile, was working behind the scenes to navigate the situation. He held a meeting with Mrs. Parker and the school's counselor to discuss ways to repair the classroom environment and rebuild trust with her students. He also met with the boy privately, encouraging him to share his feelings and making sure he felt supported. But as much as Mr. Bennett tried to resolve the issue, he couldn't shake the feeling that the school community was at a crossroads. By midweek, the tension reached its peak. During recess, a small group of parents showed up unannounced, asking to speak with Mr. Bennett about the incident. They expressed their concerns, not just about what had happened in Mrs. Parker's class, but about the broader issue of how the school handled discipline and accountability. One parent, in particular, spoke passionately. "We send our kids here because we trust you to take care of them," they said, their voice firm but emotional. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about making sure our kids feel safe, respected, and heard." Mr. Bennett listened carefully, acknowledging their concerns and promising to take action. But as he walked back to his office afterward, He couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that whatever steps he took next would set the tone not just for Mrs. Parker, but for the entire school. By the time the school day ended, everyone was on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Parents were calling, teachers were whispering, and students were watching closely, trying to piece together what was happening behind the scenes. For the boy, the spotlight was overwhelming. He didn't want to be the center of attention anymore. He just wanted things to go back to normal. But deep down, he knew that wasn't possible. Too much had happened, and the situation had grown far beyond his control. All he could do now was wait and hope that his dad, his hero, would find a way to make things right. As the days passed, the weight of the incident lingered. The boy went through the motions, trying to focus on schoolwork, but the stares from his classmates and the hushed whispers that followed him wherever he went were hard to ignore. He had hoped things would go back to normal, but it felt like everything was different now. His dad had assured him that things would work out, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen, and that uncertainty was starting to feel like its own kind of pressure. One morning, as Mr. Bennett sat in his office, reviewing the final draft of a letter he planned to send out to the parents, he was interrupted by a knock on the door. His assistant, Mia, entered with an envelope in her hand, looking unusually serious. "You might want to take a look at this," she said, placing the envelope on his desk. Mr. Bennett frowned as he reached for it. It wasn't marked with the usual school logo or a return address, but it was sealed with a deep red wax emblem, which immediately sent a chill through him. He hesitated for a moment, wondering what kind of letter this could be, before he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the contents. As he read, his stomach tightened. The letter was anonymous, but it was clear that the sender knew far more than they should. It detailed the incident with the glue, but not from the perspective of a teacher or a student. It included specific details about the private conversations that had taken place in his office, conversations that, up until now, had been confidential. Whoever wrote this letter seemed to know not only about his son's feelings, but also about the tense meetings he'd had with Mrs. Parker and the growing unrest among the parents. The letter ended with a chilling warning. "This is just the beginning. Watch your back." Mr. Bennett's heart raced as he reread the letter. Who could have sent this? And how did they know so much? He looked up at Mia, who had been quietly watching him. "I don't know who wrote this," he said, his voice low, "but I think someone is trying to cause trouble." Mia nodded, her expression serious. "What do you want to do about it?" He stared at the letter, his mind racing. He knew that whatever was happening was bigger than just a simple mistake in the classroom. Someone was using the incident as leverage, trying to fuel the fire and manipulate the situation for reasons he couldn't yet understand. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the stakes were rising quickly. This wasn't just about a teacher's mistake anymore. This was about his ability to keep control of the school, protect his son, and ensure the trust of the parents and staff. "I need to find out who sent this," Mr. Bennett said, his voice firm. "And I need to make sure that whatever happens next doesn't spiral out of control." The next day, the tension in the school was palpable. Parents were still calling, some demanding answers, others expressing their support for Mrs. Parker. Mr. Bennett had spent hours that morning talking with the school board, trying to figure out the best course of action. He knew that no matter how careful he was, someone would still find a way to challenge his decisions. But now, after reading that letter, he realized that the problem was bigger than just one person or one mistake. It was a whole network of discontent that had been building for some time. Meanwhile, Mrs. Parker had returned to school, but she wasn't her usual self. She had delivered her apology to the class, and though some students had seemed to accept it, others were still whispering about the incident. She had hoped that things would settle down, but instead, it felt as if every move she made was being watched. She spent her days looking over her shoulder, second-guessing every decision she made, as though the very walls of the school were closing in on her. It wasn't until after school, when the final bell had rung and the hallways emptied out, that the real surprise came. Mrs. Parker was in the teacher's lounge, grabbing her things, when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, and against her better judgment, she answered. "Mrs. Parker," a voice on the other end said, its tone cold and unfamiliar. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "You don't know me," the voice continued, "but I know what happened with your class, and I know that you're trying to fix things, trying to make it right. But let me make one thing clear. You're not in control here anymore." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You're being watched," the voice said. "And if you don't do exactly as we say, things will get much worse." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Mrs. Parker stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind spinning. This wasn't just a disgruntled parent. It felt like something much darker, something more calculated. She had thought the worst was behind her, but now she felt like she was being dragged into something she couldn't escape. Later that night, as Mrs. Parker tried to make sense of the call, she received an email. The subject line was simple: "It's time to choose sides." Curious and frightened, she opened it. The email was brief but chilling. It accused her of being part of a larger scheme to discredit Mr. Bennett, to undermine his leadership, and to create division in the school. It hinted that there were others involved, others who were just waiting for the right moment to make their move. The email ended with a chilling ultimatum: stay silent or face the consequences. Mrs. Parker sat back, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She had no idea who was behind this, but she could feel the walls closing in on her. She was in the middle of something much bigger than she had ever imagined, and now she had to decide whether to stay silent or fight back. But if she fought back, she feared it might destroy everything she had worked for, not just her career, but her relationships with the students, the parents, and even Mr. Bennett. As she stared at the screen, the phone call, the email, and the weight of the anonymous letter Mr. Bennett had received all began to connect in her mind. Something sinister was happening in the school, something more than just a teacher's mistake. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized. No one could be trusted, and everyone had their own agenda. With the stakes higher than ever, the tension between Mrs. Parker, Mr. Bennett, and the mysterious forces behind the scenes grew unbearable. Neither knew who they could rely on, or how deep the conspiracy ran. All they knew was that it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. And when it did, no one would be prepared for what was about to unfold. The next morning, Mr. Bennett arrived at school earlier than usual, his mind racing. The unsettling letter, the ominous phone call to Mrs. Parker, and the email with its chilling ultimatum had all set his thoughts in motion. It was clear now. There was something more to this situation than just a simple misunderstanding. The undercurrent of tension, the whispers in the hallways, and the anonymous threats suggested a far-reaching scheme that was threatening not just his family, but the entire foundation of the school. As he walked into his office, his assistant Mia was already there, sorting through papers. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You okay?" she asked gently, sensing something was off. Mr. Bennett didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, trying to focus. "No, Mia. There's something going on here, and I need to figure out who's behind it." Just as he spoke, the phone rang. Mia glanced at him before answering. Principal Bennett's office. She paused, listening. Then her eyes widened, and she handed the phone to him. "It's Mrs. Parker." His heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Parker's voice was frantic on the other end. "I need to meet with you right now," she said, her words rushed and urgent. "I think I know who's behind everything. I've uncovered something." Without hesitation, Mr. Bennett agreed. He told Mia he'd be out of the office for a while and headed straight to Mrs. Parker's classroom. When he arrived, he found her pacing nervously by the door. She looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "You need to sit down," she said, her voice shaking. I've been doing some digging. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I think I've uncovered who's been orchestrating all of this. Mr. Bennet's heart raced as he sat down. Who? What have you found? Mrs. Parker swallowed hard before continuing. It's one of the parents. Someone close to the school. They've been pulling strings behind the scenes, using the incident to manipulate others. She handed him a folder. Inside were printouts of emails, social media posts, and other documents. The name at the top of the most recent email made his blood run cold. It was from a well-known parent who had been vocal in their dissatisfaction with the school's administration. Is this? Mr. Bennet started, his voice faltering. Is this who I think it is? Mrs. Parker nodded grimly. Yes, it's Sarah Langford. Sarah Langford had always been a vocal parent. Her son was a student in the school, and she had never been shy about expressing her opinions on the school's leadership. She had raised concerns about everything from curriculum changes to how Mr. Bennet handled disciplinary matters. But until now, he had never suspected that she might be behind the chaos. Why would she do this? Mr. Bennet asked, his mind spinning. What's her motive? Mrs. Parker shook her head. I don't know. But it's all right there in the emails. She's been stirring the pot, sending anonymous letters to parents, leaking information to other teachers, all to create division. And the glue incident. That was the perfect opportunity for her to manipulate the situation. Mr. Bennet felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had always tried to work with the parents, to keep an open line of communication. To think that someone in his own community could be plotting against him and using his son as a pawn was devastating. We need to confront her, Mr. Bennet said, standing up. Right now. But as he turned to leave, Mrs. Parker stopped him. Wait. There's something else, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't want to say it earlier, but I think Sarah's not acting alone. Mr. Bennet turned back, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? I think she has an ally. Someone within the school. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Who? Mrs. Parker hesitated, then whispered one name. Mia. Mr. Bennet's world seemed to tilt. His assistant, the one person he had trusted the most. The person who had been there every step of the way, offering support when everything seemed to be falling apart. I don't have proof, Mrs. Parker continued, but I've seen the way she's been acting. She knows too much about what's going on, and she's been asking too many questions. Mr. Bennet's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Are you sure? I don't know for certain, but I'm starting to think she's been feeding information to Sarah, Mrs. Parker said. I'm sorry, but I think we need to be careful. Mr. Bennet's mind raced as he considered the possibility. Mia had been loyal, had worked tirelessly to help him maintain control of the situation. But could it be true? Could someone so close to him be involved in a scheme that threatened everything he had worked for? He glanced at the clock. Time was running out. He had to act, but he wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. The school, the parents, even his closest ally, everything had become uncertain. I'll handle this, Mr. Bennet said, his voice tight with resolve. But I need you to stay alert, Mrs. Parker. We're not done yet. As he left her classroom, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He needed to confront Mia, but he also knew he had to be careful. If she was involved, she might have been playing him all along. He couldn't risk making any mistakes. When he returned to his office, Mia was there, waiting for him, her face a mask of concern. Is everything okay? She asked. Mr. Bennet closed the door behind him and locked it, his gaze cold. We need to talk. He could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For a moment, there was silence, and then the tension in the air thickened. He had no proof, but the weight of suspicion was unbearable. He stepped closer to her, his voice low and stern. Mia, are you working with Sarah Langford? Her face paled. For a brief moment, he thought she might crack. But instead, she stood frozen, her expression unreadable. "Mia," Mr. Bennett repeated, his voice edged with anger. "Tell me the truth." The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a sudden, unexpected smirk, Maya spoke. "You really thought you could trust me, didn't you?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Before he could react, Mia's expression darkened, and she stepped back, pulling something out from behind her desk. It was a flash drive. "You're not the only one who's been gathering information," Maya said, her voice cold now, detached. "I've been taking notes too. You've been so blinded by your own power that you didn't see what was happening right under your nose." And then, with a chilling finality, she clicked a button on her computer, revealing a series of emails. It wasn't just Sarah Langford involved. Mia had been working with her all along. The entire scheme had been a calculated effort to bring Mr. Bennett down, and Mia had been one of its masterminds. "Congratulations," Maya said, her voice laced with mock sweetness. "You just walked right into my trap." The room felt suffocating as Mr. Bennett stood frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of the betrayal in front of him. Mia, the trusted assistant he had relied on, the one who had been by his side through it all, was the mastermind behind the plot to bring him down. The shock of the revelation hit him hard, but beneath the shock, a rush of anger started to boil. Mia's smirk grew wider as she watched him process the information. She seemed to relish the power she now held, the control she had been secretly pulling all along. Mr. Bennett could feel his heart racing as he tried to control his emotions, forcing himself to breathe through the storm of thoughts that rushed through his mind. "You were never in control, Bennett," Maya said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I watched you, listened to every decision you made. You thought you were doing what was best for the school, but all you did was let everyone walk all over you. Sarah saw that. She saw an opportunity, and I made sure it worked." The words stung, but there was a part of Mr. Bennett that remained resolute. He had always prided himself on being fair, even-handed, but he had been too trusting. Now, in the face of Mia's betrayal, he realized he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated the lengths to which people would go for power and control. But the more he listened to Maya's venomous words, the more he understood that this wasn't just about personal vendettas. It was about the school, the future of it, the students, and the very foundation of trust that had been broken. He couldn't let this corrupt scheme destroy everything. "You think you've won," Mr. Bennett said, his voice steady, despite the swirling anger in his chest. "You think you've played me, but you're wrong. This isn't over. You might have thought you had me trapped, but I'm not the one who's going to lose." Mia's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the flash drive. "You're delusional." "No," Mr. Bennett said, his voice growing firmer. "I've spent years building this school, and I'll be damned if I let you and Sarah Langford tear it all down." He turned to the door, his hand on the handle, but paused for a moment. "You should have known better than to underestimate me." Before Mia could react, Mr. Bennett was already moving. He walked out of his office with a clear purpose now. He was done with being passive, done with letting people take advantage of his goodwill. It was time to take control of his school and his future. The first step was confronting Sarah Langford. He knew that if he was going to root out the corruption, he couldn't let anyone think they had the upper hand. His mind was racing as he stormed through the hallways to the front office, where he found Mia, who had been waiting for her next move. Mia didn't even try to stop him. She knew it was too late now. As Mr. Bennett walked out to the parking lot, he saw Sarah Langford's car in the lot. He didn't hesitate. This was the moment that could change everything. He marched right up to her car and knocked on the window, causing Sarah to jump in surprise. "What's this about?" she demanded, rolling the window down halfway. "You know exactly what this is about," Mr. Bennett said, his voice steely with authority. "You've been using the incident with my son to manipulate everything. You've been orchestrating a plan to bring down my leadership." Sarah's face blanched, but she quickly recovered, flashing him a cold, calculating smile. And what are you going to do about it? Expose me to the school? You'll just be making more enemies. I'm not going to expose you to anyone, Mr. Bennet replied. But I will make sure this ends. The parents, the teachers, none of them will have any doubt about who's been pulling the strings. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sarah knew she had no more cards to play. She looked around, as if searching for a way to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Finally, her expression faltered, and she let out a long, tired sigh. "You have no idea how much I've been trying to fix things," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "The school's been failing, and you've been too blinded by your own ego to see it. You've lost control, Mr. Bennet." Mr. Bennet took a deep breath. He knew she wasn't going to admit everything, but he didn't need her confession. The damage had been done, and he would make sure it didn't escalate any further. "You're right about one thing," Mr. Bennet said. "The school has been failing. But it's not because of me. It's because of people like you who think power is the answer. I'll take back control now. The truth will come out." With that, he turned and walked back to the school building, leaving Sarah behind in her car, realizing she had lost. As he entered the principal's office, he found the evidence of Mia's treachery, the flash drive, the emails, the trail of manipulation and lies. He was determined to put an end to it, to clean the slate and move forward. The following weeks were filled with meetings and investigations. The school board was informed of the conspiracy, and both Sarah Langford and Mia were held accountable for their actions. It was a difficult time, but Mr. Bennet's leadership and determination were unquestionable. He made sure the students, staff, and parents knew the truth, and he worked tirelessly to regain their trust. Through it all, he focused on what really mattered, the students. He remembered why he had become a principal in the first place: to shape the future, to provide a place for young minds to grow and learn. He made it his mission to ensure that nothing would stand in the way of that goal, not even betrayal. And as for Mia and Sarah, their schemes had come to a dramatic halt. In the end, their hunger for power had led them to their own downfall. The trust they had broken couldn't be repaired. Their future at the school was over, and Mr. Bennet knew that the school would move on, stronger and more united than before. As Mr. Bennet stood in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened, he realized that sometimes the greatest challenges come from the people you least expect. But through it all, he had learned the importance of trust, integrity, and standing firm when everything seemed to be falling apart. The final twist came unexpectedly when Mr. Bennet received a letter in his mailbox, a simple note with no signature. It read, "You were always meant to lead. Don't forget that." And with that, he knew that despite everything, he had emerged victorious. The battle was over, but his journey was just beginning.